welcome to another episode of the Life of Elvis podcast. I'm your host Elvis, and today with me is Miranda Young, who is a paranormal investigator. So we're happy to have you on.
I'm happy to be here, Elvis. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
No, anytime. It's a pleasure. So basically, you drive around on your bike and investigate haunted places, right?
I do. I travel all around the United States to different haunted and historic locations on my motorcycle, and I highlight them on my web series, Ghost Biker Explorations.
That's pretty cool. And you also co-own the haunted jail Kristy was talking about in episode 19, right?
Yes, I do. About a year ago, I ended up creating a business with my best friend, Dr. Kristy Sumner, who's been on your show. And we opened up, we created History, Highways, and Haunts, our company, and then opened the historic Scott County Jail. So we've been open for a year now.
Great. So how did you get to this? At the beginning, were you skeptical about the paranormal?
You know, I've always been interested in it. Always been interested more so from the storytelling side. I grew up here in the Appalachian Mountains of East Tennessee. And so my grandmother, she always shared lots of different stories about local mountain haunts and different things that she experienced as well as folklore. So from a really young age, I would spend as much time as I could with her listening to these stories. And then my dad would also take me back roads riding in the mountains here of East Tennessee and talk about just how things used to be and the way, you know, some of the ghosts of the past. And so I spent every bit of time that I could in the libraries and in different places learning more about these spirits and ghosts. And it wasn't until I was in, excuse me a second, my cat decided to, hey, I am so sorry.
That's fine.
Stop it. Let me hold that thought one second. Let me take him out of here.
Okay.
Hey, get out of here. Stop.
Typical cat behavior.
I sincerely apologize. He
right.
snuck in and he was tearing up a box that I have sitting over here. So I am so sorry. But as I was saying, I spent all the time in the library that I could. And it wasn't until about 15 years ago when I started a job at a company over here. And my background is in photography and marketing. And so one of the guys who is in our human resources department came up to me and asked if I could look at some pictures. He saw my background in photography and wanted me to essentially look at these photos from their investigations and try to debunk them, try to come up with a logical explanation, or maybe even confirm if it could be something supernatural. And so I started looking at a lot of photos, and then they invited me to go on an investigation. After I did my first investigation, I was hooked, you know, hearing the disembodied voices and seeing some of the equipment go off. I found that I was hooked at that point, and they invited me to join the team. I was on the team for about 8 years. And then I found that really I was kind of going off on my own, riding my motorcycle to a lot of different places, really doing more urbex and urban exploration and really putting those photos out there, sharing the story about those locations. And I thought, why don't I just document it through video? And so I sat down and did the branding for Ghost Biker Explorations, decided how I wanted to put it out. And then now at this point, we just wrapped up season 5 and already started recording on season 6.
Sounds great. I still need to catch up and watch some of those episodes. Hopefully soon. I'm gonna have a few days off. So before we move forward, you mentioned the stories you heard when you were a kid about the Appalachian Mountains and those regions. So what kind of stuff did you hear about it? I think at some point I've heard, throughout the years, something about it, but I can't really recollect.
Absolutely. So the different regions of America here, have a lot of different stories behind them.
Mm-hmm.
And here in the Appalachian Mountains, we have a lot of stories about some of the local cryptids, which would be like the Bigfoot or Sasquatch, Dog Man, Skunk Man, or Skunk Ape. Some of those stories, a lot of what she told me was some of the local folklore from some of the um, different areas there on the mountains, like kind of when to plant your garden, based on the signs of in the body and the signs of nature. She was to the point she could tell when the first snowfall was going to be based on based on when the first frost hit. And a lot of the folklore about really just raising your garden, raising your family, and that sort of thing was a lot of the stuff that she would tell me, as well as just some of the um, haunting stories that she and some of the other locals in the area. This would have been around 1908 when she was born. And so,
Mm-hmm.
so this would have been in the very, very early 1900s, 19 teens, when she was sharing some of these different stories from. So I was just always fascinated and wanted to take in as much of that as I could.
Mm-hmm. Can you share some of those stories?
Yeah, so she actually told me whenever she was a child, her uncle had passed away, and she didn't know it. Back then in the early 1900s, in the mountains, word didn't travel as fast, obviously, as it does today, and really didn't travel as fast as it did, back in the 70s and 80s. And so, she didn't know that he had actually passed, but she said she was sitting in her house and said that all of a sudden her uncle walked through the house. He told her hello and told her he would be seeing her soon. She thought he had just come for a visit, and so she greeted him. She said, "Yeah, I'll see you here very soon." And where are you going? And said that he just walked through the house and stopped in the kitchen and went on out the front door. Apparently, several others of her brothers had also seen him as well. Well, come to find out later that evening, when her aunt came to visit, she said that her uncle had passed away. And so she ended up asking, what time was it that he had passed away? And it had been right about that time, just before he had passed away, just before she saw him there come through the house. And so she believed that he was just kind of passing through and saying goodbye to her and her siblings. So several different stories like that she shared, that of people stopping by right after they had supposedly passed away.
Mm-hmm. Cool story. I've heard quite a few times about these. When someone passes away, they either sometimes get a phone call or see that person,
Yeah.
hear that person, and it must be a crazy thing to realize that. Hold on, I just spoken to him, and it was just around the time they passed away.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really mind-blowing when you think about it. It's touching
Yes.
to a point, but it's also mind-blowing that this could happen, because, what's the explanation? And so after she had shared some of those stories with me, that really got my mind going and got me really interested. And I read about a lot of different stories like that in some of the different books that I was reading at that time, and just truly fascinated of, you know, what is this phenomenon? Is this, truly somebody passing through? Is it a full body apparition? Is it some type of other dimension? So I was really fascinated when I started reading those, and then how similar a lot of the different experiences that I've read about are to what my grandmother told me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, if you look for some proper explanation in science, don't have any. They would just say it's impossible. Couldn't happen
Yeah.
that way. It's like, really? But then when you look at some older traditions, um, and when I talk about this topic, always what comes to my mind is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. For
Mm.
thousands of years, they knew that when someone passes away, there's a way how to communicate with them, and somehow they managed to really map out the afterlife in that region. And it seems when you read about it, it's like this could actually be.
Absolutely.
Now, one of the main takeaways from the book is basically that you can communicate with the dead; they can hear you, but you might not hear them. Most cases you don't. It's not impossible, but you know.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's so many different ways that these spirits manifest whenever we're doing these investigations. You know, I'm a firm believer that spirit communication happens more often than what people realize. But because we're in the middle of our day-to-day lives, we're not listening, we're not really paying attention. A lot of the time we miss those subtle communications that, that we might hear if we were actually sitting and paying attention. You know, sometimes we catch voices on our recorders that we don't hear in the moment. And then other times we'll hear them in the moment, and we're very fortunate to be able to also capture them on the recorders. I think it's just a different way of manifesting. Sometimes I think it's a little bit easier than a shadow figure or a full body apparition. But you're exactly right. I mean, there's times that, they hear us, and it is a scientific proven fact that whenever somebody passes away, the hearing is the last thing to go. And so they always say, when hospice comes in, or whenever your comfort care folks come in that's taking care of people who are getting ready to pass, they always say, be careful what you say, because the hearing is the last thing to go, even though they may not be able to communicate back with us. And so I feel it's the same thing, that a lot of the time they do hear and see what we're doing. We just don't always hear it, or we don't always pick up on those cues that they're putting out there when they're communicating with us.
I didn't know that about the hearing. It's quite interesting. It kind of goes along with what I was saying about the Tibetan Book of the Dead and their knowledge about this topic. It's quite interesting. And yeah, that's right. Things like anything that's above normal, and these kinds of experiences, or even things like intuition, creativity. If we got so much noise, which we have, through all the distractions that we have in our lives, all the stress and the lifestyle people have, all that drowns out, because those are really very subtle things.
They usually are.
Yeah.
They usually are.
Yeah. And if you don't meditate, if you don't silence your mind, at least sometimes, you're not going to get through the signal.
That's very true. And, there was an uptick in paranormal activity during the pandemic. I know here in the United States, whenever everything kind of shut down and people were working from their homes, there was a reported uptick in a lot of paranormal activity. Now, there's a lot of theories as to why that could be, whether it be because the world was going through a different and traumatic experience, and you've got, the collective conscious and everything. But I tend to think that it's in part because we're all home. We're all home. We're all focusing differently. We're not focusing on the day-to-day stress of getting out, and we're listening and paying attention a little bit more. And so I think that that gave a lot of people kind of that idle time, and I think they started picking up on that there's more that goes on than what people realize. And it goes on during the day, not just during the night, when a lot of investigators will go and investigate. And I also think that, people tend to, the activity that happens, yes, there's times where they'll pull things off the wall, or you'll see something being moved. But from what I've experienced, a lot of the time it's more subtle, and it's more quiet. And I think that's why it's missed a lot.
Yeah. It's also interesting, because I've heard many times certain paranormal phenomena, they also tend to happen on places or on events which are quite tragic, the natural disasters or otherwise, like the Mothman in the 60s. He appeared just around the time when the bridge collapsed, just before that. Or even now, I've heard from the Ukraine. Apparently, they've been seeing a lot more UFOs in the area, things like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Same with Iraq and Afghanistan. There were some military people who reported seeing lights and strange crafts over there, which didn't seem to be human projects. And so maybe whilst we were going through all this stuff during the pandemic,
Yeah,
that could have
just
also caused an uptick.
absolutely. Anything that's tragic like that, I mean, it not only affects the spirit world, but affects us and how we view it. And, there's, you hear, I was actually just listening to a podcast about a plane that crashed. And for the longest time, right after the plane had crashed, there were people who were going, they were getting knocks on their doors in the community where the plane had crashed at. And they were people that were coming to the door and saying they were lost. They didn't know what had happened. And it was believed that these were some of the spirits from the plane that crashed. Also, I had just recently watched an episode of Unsolved Mysteries that was so fascinating to me about a tsunami in, I want to say it was in Japan, I believe. I can't remember exactly which country it was, but it was a really bad tsunami, and they were having experiences with people who had perished in the tsunami just after. These people didn't know they were dead. They didn't know they had passed. And so you often hear about that when tragic things happen, of people getting visitations or having strange occurrences that are happening around them, whether it potentially be UFO activity or spirit activity. It's something you hear quite often around tragic events.
Mm-hmm. Which year was this tsunami?
I'm trying to remember. I don't feel like it was too long ago. I would need to go back and watch the episode. It was an episode there in the first season of Unsolved Mysteries, and right. Just absolutely fascinating. They had to translate the entire episode, and it was thousands of people who was reporting seeing and experiencing this activity, and I was just truly riveted by it and how by this one event, all these people were affected on many different levels, and they were having a lot of different spirit activity based on it.
Right. So I was asking because I remember in 2004 there was the big tsunami in Indonesia and that area, and then
I think that's the one. Yeah, actually,
there was also in 2011, I think, if I know right, the one where Fukushima, the nuclear power plant, got damaged. I've heard that in that area around the nuclear power plant, they were also seeing strange things after that happened.
I would totally believe that. We have several places, Sloss Furnace down in Birmingham, Alabama here. They had several folks fall into one of the furnaces, and they didn't, it happened so quick. They didn't know they had passed, and people were seeing and experiencing these 4 guys who had fallen into this furnace. When something like that happens so instantly, you often hear stories, and it's not uncommon for people to experience this, especially when it's in mass groups. I love doing that when there's either a mass UFO sighting or a mass experience, and you start hearing all these different stories, and these stories corroborate each other's story. And so that's always fascinating to me, and I can get lost in the data of just seeing how similar all of these different stories are.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting aspect of all these phenomena. Not necessarily just hauntings, but even UFOs and all the other things. That, if people were making this up, there will be a lot more variation in the stories, especially if you look all the way back to what was going on and compare all the different stories throughout the times. There's just too much similarity, even things like near-death experiences, even psychedelic trips and all that stuff. It's there must be something going on.
Yeah, and if you look at the time frame too, some of these stories that took place in the 50s and 60s, even as far back as the 30s and 40s, when you start looking back at some of this information, information didn't travel as quickly and it wasn't as readily available. And so when you've got people who live hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, that's sharing these same experiences, there's no way that they could have known or seen, where today, something happens, it's instantly on the internet and we
Mm-hmm.
know, and people are more likely to go and kind of take on that experience. But when you look at the information, travel time and such of back then, um, it's really quite amazing when you start seeing these similar stories, and there's no way that they could take them from someone else when they're so far away.
Yeah, definitely. So when you were saying, when you were starting to get involved in this research, you said some people show you some photographies.
Mhm.
So what was on them, and what kind of conclusion did you come to?
So the first couple photographs I looked at came from a residential investigation. The team that I had become a member of, or was soon to become a member of, they did two types of investigations. They did the residential home investigations where people would reach out and they would be having unexplained activity, and the team's goal was to come in and try to either debunk it or try to come up with a logical explanation or even really validate it. And then the other type were commercial locations, which would be kind of like the jail that Kristy and I own, Waverly Hills, the locations that you essentially pay to go spend the night in. And so this particular location, it was a residential home. The homeowners had gone away for a week and they had allowed the team to come in and do active investigations in the home while they were gone, as well as set up static cameras and static audio recorders that were just going to play overnight. And so I remember the first particular picture I saw came from the kitchen, and there was essentially a light mist in there. And then the next, one of the cabinet doors was open, and it was open in the area where this mist was. And so, what I like to know when I see those pictures is, was there anybody on the property? What time was it? I like to know what the temperature is. I like to know what the weather is, because, you can get moisture, you can get different things that are going to affect that. And I kind of went in as, I've always been a skeptical believer. I like to kind of keep that mindset that it's like, especially when it comes to photography, what kind of camera are you using? Are you using a digital camera versus a regular film camera? Because you do get different anomalies whenever you have
And that's why I
digital.
wanted to ask, like,
Mm-hmm.
whether they were digital or analog, because I've heard that it's a big difference between these two technologies. Because with digital cameras, like what we have in smartphones, it's
Mm-hmm.
basically just captures normal light and it does a lot of processing afterwards through
Absolutely.
software. But analog cameras, they would capture a lot wider spectrum, and there's obviously not no software processing going on.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so I like to try to know all of those basics. So whenever they would send me the photographs, I had a list of questions just like that I wanted to know. And so I also wanted, and I do this when I do an investigation, I always try to go in during the daylight time and really just take as many photographs as I can of the entire room, because some of these places, there are things, the way they're positioned, and when you're in the heat of the moment on an investigation and you're all heightened and excited, and of course you're in a dark room and you're looking around, things look and are perceived much different when you're in that moment. So I like to have a reference that I can go back and look at. So I know that those first couple pictures were from in there in the kitchen. And then also another was from their family, their doorbell, their security doorbell camera that they had. And so we were getting these weird light anomalies on this doorbell camera. And of course, at the time, it was a very new technology. And so I was having to research the way that the way they film, the way it's set up. But for me, most importantly, I wanted to see what this area looked like during the day and see if my perception, is this coming toward me? What is the distance that I'm seeing this? Could this be a bug or something else? So it was a lot of photos like that that they had captured during that week. Apparently, they had also gotten some audio captures on their recorder, and I was very interested to see if those audio captures, what their timing was, if that happened around the same time that we were getting these photos. So there's a lot of things that I like to take into account whenever I'm going and viewing these photos. There was a couple I was able to actually debunk based on weather and atmospheric changes that were going on, because I even wanted to know, in this house when they're gone, is the heat on? What is the humidity level here? So it's sometimes things that investigators don't always think about whenever they're putting static cameras and stuff up. But, there's a lot of things that can affect, rather than just saying, here's a photo, I need you to tell me the story behind it. Essentially, I've even heard that you can hear a train. We always try to look at everything that's going on around. And so I've even heard that if the weather is just right and it's clear and, certain times of the day and certain types of weather, you can hear a train 30 miles away, because you can sit and say, there's no railroad tracks nearby. What is this I'm hearing? But there are certain circumstances where you can hear that. So a lot of atmosphere and a lot of environmental factors go in that when I was looking at these photos that I really wanted to pay attention to. And I don't, for me, when you're watching my stuff, I don't really put a lot of photography evidence out there, because essentially I'm able to debunk a lot of my own stuff. And some people will take 100 pictures and 80 of them will be unexplained. But I always say that, if you take 100 pictures and you get one, maybe two photos that are kind of odd, and usually that's a good day if you can get one or two pictures that are unexplained out of 100.
Yeah, but always the same thing also with other phenomena, like, for example, UFOs. There was
Yeah.
always they will always say like 97% of all the pictures and everything is easy to debunk. It can be like a weather balloon or something like that. But
Mhm.
there's always been like a small percentage that really cannot be explained.
Yeah, it truly is a small percentage. Again, I do believe that more things happen than what we realize. But when you start looking at technology, you have to really know your tools and you have to really know your technology. And that's where, when it comes to recorders, digital recorders versus analog recorders, digital cameras versus the analog cameras, there's a lot of things that goes into it. And there are a lot of false positives out there, even though, as I said earlier, I do believe more stuff happens than what we realize. We just don't always capture it. And I sometimes think that we do have a lot of false positives, as long as we're not being accountable for everything that's going on. I just think that that's one of the most important things, is to know your equipment, know your environment, and know your location. And at least to the best of your ability, to be able to determine if something is essentially unexplained versus something that can be debunked. And personal experiences, we factor those on top of that. It's hard to really qualify a personal experience, because, you know, I've always got my recorder going. I've always got my video camera going from the minute I step foot on a location. And, if I'm starting to experience cold spots, cold temperature, or something like that, I can tell you, I can show you the chill bumps. I can show you, the hair raise on my arm or whatever. I can also show you the temperature dropping, but sometimes that doesn't always register and we can't show. Or sometimes the way we feel either on a metaphysical level. So the
It's also
personal,
hard to say what caused it, really. Like, is it
exactly.
something natural, or is it actually something paranormal? It's hard to tell.
Absolutely. So it's really hard because most investigators do have personal experiences. I have to take you at your word and have some faith that you're telling me the truth in what you experienced. But then also you also have to stop and say, if you're in this location, your body is heightened anyways when you're in these locations. We're typically, we're scared or we're super excited about it. All of that kind of plays into our reactions to it as well. And so I've kind of learned, because one of the things I like to do when I go to these locations, if I can, I actually like to sleep in them because, I will do an active investigation. And then if I have the opportunity to lay down and sleep for a couple hours, I like to do that and keep the recorder and the audio going, because I get different responses when I'm asleep. And so I've kind of learned, my friends will give me a hard time when something happens. If we're in a room and I've been asleep and it wakes me up, I'll lay there and I'll ask the question. I'm like, okay, did anybody hear that? I won't move. And they're like, it's so funny. You're just kind of laying there, not moving. And it's like, well, I don't want to create a false positive. I don't want to jump up and cause dust in the room to scatter, causing orbs to fly, and then be like, oh, I heard this and here are these orbs. Or I don't want to take a chance of moving in case there is a shadow figure or something around that the camera's picking up on. Now, that's hard, and that's not to say that I don't always jump, because there's times during investigations it's startling. But when I'm sleeping and doing things, I try to be as calm as possible so that I don't affect anything and create any false
Hmm.
positives going on when I hear something.
That makes sense. It's gotta be very scientific about this entire subject, rather
Yeah.
than being like, "Oh my god, this is a ghost." Like in some of the shows, you see that kind of behavior. But that's actually a good idea to sleep in those places, like, because first thing that came to my mind is that whilst you sleep and you have a dream, during that state, there can be, like we were saying, during your normal waking state, when we are stressed and busy and all that stuff, you can't really get a signal from something else, something extrasensory. But whilst you sleep, that's when certain things can come to you much more easily. Have you had any
Absolutely.
interesting dreams whilst you were in one of these places?
There was one place, and it's really interesting you mentioned that, because there have been 5 different places lately that I have slept at. And like I said, for the most part, I'll investigate as long as I can, try to sleep a few hours. Only one place did I have an interesting dream, because all the other times I've slept in solitary confinement in a prison. I've slept in a couple abandoned homes. I've slept in one of the houses that's supposed to be known as one of the most evil homes in America. I didn't have the same experience as what some of the others did, but I've slept there. And honestly, when I laid down, I've even slept in a couple funeral homes, and I will go into such a deep sleep. I don't know if it's because I'm so exhausted from investigating, but I will go into a very, very deep sleep, and things happen. I don't hear them happening around me. There's been a couple times I have, but I was actually sleeping at Post Town, and it was part of so it was Post Town Elementary School, and it's in Ohio. And so I was part of an investigation that I did with Soul Sisters Paranormal, and I also did with VP Paranormal, um, from Michigan. And so they were all investigating. I got really tired, and I thought, I'm going to go sleep on this floor, take like an hour long nap. And so I didn't even realize I'd gone to sleep, because I laid down on this little flat surface there. And the school was really, really big. And so Soul Sisters and VP Paranormal, they were in a totally different part of the building. But before I laid down, they did come and tell me, where they were going to be. So they went off. Well, it seemed like just a few minutes. And I thought that Kristy came over to where I was, and she was asking me if I was still sleeping. And I'm like, well, I just laid down. I've not had a chance to go to sleep yet. And she started like aggressively arguing with me. And I'm like, what in the world is wrong with you? And so we kind of went back and forth, arguing a little bit. And she's like, well, I'm just going to go over here and investigate. And so I ended up waking up not long after that. And I went and I found the group, and I saw Kristy, and I was like, what's the deal? And she was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, you didn't come and have a conversation with me and like kind of trying to start an argument about investigating. And she's like, no, I've been with them the whole time. And I was like, I literally didn't realize. I mean, I felt like I had just laid down and she came, but I must have gone into such a deep sleep because I have the video and the audio where I'm literally laying there asleep. I don't move. Nobody comes and sees me. Nothing. But I thought we had this conversation, and I'm surprised I wasn't talking in my sleep, But that's been about the only time that I had a dream. Now, I do know when I was investigating Revenant Acres, and again, it was a situation, it was like 45 degrees, so it was very, very cold outside. It was 45 degrees inside the house. It was in the 30s there when I was outside. And I went to sleep. I didn't even hear the tools going off. But Tiffany, the girl I was investigating with, she absolutely couldn't sleep. And anytime she would start to fall asleep, she would see something rush up on her and said that it would just stand there and just breathe on her. And then she would wake up and realize she had been asleep. So for me, the most part, I don't, but I do feel like it's a different type of investigating, because I don't know if it's because you're on a different astral plane, or if maybe you're in that more vulnerable state. And then, of course, here you are sleeping in a solitary confinement area, and the spirits that are just going about their normal activities, whether it be residual or intelligent, they see you laying there, and that's something kind of out of the norm for what they're used to. I'm not really sure why I get some of the stuff I get, but those are just a few of the theories that come to my mind instantly and make sense to me.
Yeah. It might be a combination of all these things.
Probably is. Yeah. I do believe the vulnerable state plays a big part of it, because when you are going in, the matter of which way you communicate, does tend to bring out different communication from the spirits. And I do feel like that there's times that, they're like people, there's people you click with and people you want to talk to. And maybe they, don't want to talk to me for whatever reason, especially if I'm like a female, and I'm in a location where, back in the early 1900s, the men didn't really talk to the women, so maybe they don't want to talk to me for that purpose. But when I'm laying there and in that more vulnerable state, they may be more likely to not feel that there's an aggressive presence, or not feel threatened, or feel like it's something out of their comfort zone from what they're used to, and be more likely to communicate about what's going on.
It's probably easier for them also to communicate whilst you're in that state, because the dream reality is much more malleable than this reality. And as we talked about in the previous episode with Didi, whilst you dream, you can have all sorts of experiences. I was talking about in the previous episode with her about the Tibetan yoga of sleep and dream. It was a really interesting book that I read years ago, and they they have like at least three different kinds of dreams they distinguish, and involve them. You can get teachings from other beings, souls, whatever they are. You can get precognitive dreams, which I had many times, and lots of other things. You can have dead people come to you and give you some information and stuff like that. So, yeah, all that is
It's
possible.
absolutely. And you mentioned Dee Dee, and I had her on my show one time, and she did some dream analysis for me. She had me send her a couple dreams, and I've had several recurring dreams that I sent her. I also had one that I had just happened to have a couple nights before that I sent her. And it's really amazing when you watch her work as well as other dream analyzers. And it's really interesting and fascinating to me how the mind will dream essentially in some symbols, and these are symbolic of something else and what we're going through. It's the subconscious mind and how that happens, whether it be a visitation, because I've had dreams where stuff happens and I'm like, wow, I would have never even thought about that, let alone. But it's just really interesting how much of our mind we don't use and how much we use when we're sleeping, and how just the symbolism, how it can relate to something that's going on and really, really tell a story when it just kind of seems like a jumbled mess sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. It is super fascinating, and it just shows there's so much more going on. Because, you know, in normal life, we are conscious of a very small part of everything, including ourselves and what we consider ourselves. Even though, like, what is it, 95% of everything that we do is run by a subconscious.
Yeah.
So we are not really aware of what's going on there. And the subconscious is super powerful as well.
Absolutely. And then you start throwing in muscle memory of what you've done every day. And we're constantly doing things. It may be something as simple as, did I, unplug my curling iron or the coffee maker, or, did I take my medicine for the day or whatever? You sit there and you may go and not remember you're just going through that action, or even just driving home, if you're on a trip that you've driven many, many, many times. And as you go, it's like, I don't even remember half that trip, because I was subconsciously, and my muscle memory. It really is fascinating, the things we do that we don't remember or don't realize, or the things we don't do. And we're thinking back to like the day before trying to remember to do it. And, yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, definitely is. There's just so much more to life than most people think.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
and I almost forgot to say, like when you were saying it earlier, that there seems to be a lot more going on than you usually hear from people. And it's like I said it in one of the previous episodes that I started getting into a habit when I meet someone, or even people I've known for a longer time. I started asking them whether they had any experiences they cannot explain at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever, you know, doesn't matter what. Most of the time, they will tell you something. Even if it's like something that happened to a family member or something like that, but they
Mm-hmm.
usually have something. So it's probably a lot more common that these kinds of things happen to people.
It
It's
is.
just many times they just never talk about these things because obviously there's, in our society, there's definitely a bit of a stigma going on because even science and the official narrative, they say that these things don't exist. So a lot of people are going to be hesitant to say something that, if they saw something in the middle of the night, or they had like missing time or something like that, they're going to be afraid to say it because some people their friends, co-workers, they might make fun of them, or it can be even worse than that.
Absolutely. And that is something that we do experience as paranormal investigators. I know, being a biker and motorcyclist, you know, one of the things that I like doing is I speak at a lot of different Harley Davidson events. And a lot of people look and they say, Harley Davidson ghost. I mean, they're not synonymous with each other. And so with marrying ghost biker explorations into this biker community, I can't tell you how many times I've done an event, I've spoke at the event, and people, these bikers have come up to me and they're like, I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but let me tell you about this unexplained experience I had. And 9 times out of 10, people will come up and they'll talk about it. And so it really creates a space to where people can come in and feel, I hate to use the word safe, but where they feel that they can come in and they can have the conversation and there's no stigma, no judgment. Sometimes it's just wanting me to say, well, have you considered this? Could it have been this? Or really just ask more questions about it and really kind of validate that you're not crazy. Sometimes unexplained things happen. And we do get a lot of people. So essentially, it's being able to kind of take the subculture of the paranormal and take it into more of a mainstream audience with the biker community. And it's been very widely accepted within that community that I've been a part of. And I've heard some great stories just from that, especially about some haunted roads and some haunted experiences that bikers have had while they've been on the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, sometimes it also people will tell something when they meet the right person, someone
Very true.
who it's not going to judge or anything. And many times, even people you've known for ages, like I said on the previous episode with Didi, just before I left Slovakia, where I was born, it was more than 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Even just like the period leading up to it, like the last 1 or 2 years, even within my family, there were certain things that came up that no one ever spoke about. Despite me living with them, and they never mentioned any of that.
Mm-hmm.
So usually people have lots of stories like that.
Absolutely. And you see that in the different regions of the country here in the US. Here in the Southeast, we're a very, very traditional group of people here in the South, especially here in the Appalachian Mountains. People have had these traditions and done this for generations back. And so you hear there seems to be a time frame. People my age, they're more open to talking about it, whether they have special gifts like empathy, or whether they are like clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient. People will talk about that that's around my age, which, is, 40s, 30s, that sort of thing. But then they'll say, my mom could do it, but she would never talk about it. My grandmother talked about it with me. So it always kind of seems like there's this generation that it skips. And I don't know if it's for fear of ridicule or if it's the stigma that's attached. But we often, especially here in the Southeast, you do hear that a lot of people that, and when they come on my show, because I do a live stream, and when they come on and they're talking, I often like to ask, when did you find out about your gift? And a lot of them, they'll say, I had it from an early age, but I didn't tell anyone because of whatever. And then I'll often ask, well, what did your parents say? Were they accepting of it when you would see these spirits or communicate with spirits in your home or whatever? And a lot of the time they'll say, my parents really didn't, they just told me I was just, had an active imagination. But my grandmother confirmed because she did this. So, and it went back for generations. So that's always fascinating to me when you can find that familial link. And just the fact that some people, and some people even today that are much older, they're just now kind of coming out and talking about the experiences that they had when they were a kid, and they said they just stifled it.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of things playing into this. Like I'll tell you a story that came up in my family as well. This is for my grandma, and we were pretty close. And she was born down south, so on the border with Hungary.
Okay.
And so that's where her family comes from that area. And she told me that her mom told her about this. So my great grandma. So when my great grandma, when she was a kid, less than 10 years old, I would say. So this must have been around probably just after World War One.
Okay.
Probably, somewhere in the late 1910s, early 20s, probably. So my grandma told me that her mom would go out with some workers. They would chop down trees or something like that. So she would get on the truck with them. And one day, they stopped somewhere in the forest, and there was a big hole in the ground, like a ditch or something like that. And she walked a little bit away from the truck and went on the edge of this this hole in the ground. And suddenly there was like a light being or something that came out of the hole, and it showed her a gesture like, "Don't come near this place," so she doesn't fall into a hole or something like that. So she went back, and my great grandma, she spoke to her. It was her mom, yeah. So my great grandma, and she basically told her like, "Yeah, we don't talk about this stuff."
Oh, wow.
Because obviously they were all religious, Christian in the area, and so she thought this was like Holy Mary, apparition, something like that. Which is quite common for people to think they saw that in the area. Whether it was really Holy Mary, who knows?
Right. So it sounds like from the response, though, that she knew, or that she
like
had heard of this happening. Yeah.
Like that. Yeah. They just don't talk about it.
Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating. I mean, because that's the thing. If she didn't believe, she would have probably said, "Oh, it's just your imagination," or,
yeah, exactly.
But to actually say, we don't talk about that. Either she's experienced it or she knows other people that have, and that's the kind of stories that I hear, and to me, that's validation, and that's validation to the person that experienced it. That they did experience something, well, kind of common, but supernatural.
Yeah, definitely. And this is again one of the things that came up like really late. I must have been. It was definitely not in my earlier teens. It must have been like either late teens or even early 20s.
Wow.
When she told me this.
Huh. Did she have any explanation for it, or have anything else happen after that she mentioned?
I can't remember anything else. She don't think so. Again, this was basically her mom's experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think she had anything else.
Wow.
At least not that I remember.
Yeah. Well, she obviously didn't talk about it until later on. So that's again, very cool.
If I recall properly, she wasn't exactly sure like what was going on. She just told me that they thought there was Holy Mary. Right?
Wow.
Because even of these experiences, many times the interpretation of people, it's like, was it really that, or do you think it was like in this case Holy Mary, or you got like the things that happened at Fatima in Portugal in the early 20th century. It's like, is it really something religious, or because you come from a religious background, you think that that's what you saw? That can be a big difference. I heard even some say like, if a really religious person like a Christian would saw a creature with 10 tentacles from outer space, they'll still think that it's like the Virgin Mary or something like that. So
Absolutely. And it does. Your belief system, your religious background, your lack of religious background, all of that stuff I think plays a part in the interpretation of what we're experiencing. There's some people that they don't believe in demons. They won't give them, any time of day. They won't even say the word. And then there's other people, especially on, some of the paranormal entertainment shows and stuff. That's all they experience. Everything they do, they experience is that. And so I think a lot of it comes into interpretation. I think a lot of it comes into what we seek out. Now, the unsolicited experiences, kind of like what you said your great grandmother experienced with just being there and it happened. Obviously she's not seeking something out, but the interpretation of it, of based on what she says, based on what other people that she either told or that they experienced, their belief structure is going to play a big part in that. And um yeah, that's fascinating.
yeah, it's also the case like with near-death experiences. You also hear a lot of people that, like here in the West, they would meet Jesus or some
Mm-hmm.
being like that. But in other cultures, like in India, it will be Krishna or it will be Buddha or
Mm-hmm.
something else.
Yeah. And so I think it's hard to, because I know I've listened to podcasts and talked to different people where they say, can you separate the religion from the paranormal? And I think that's really hard because I know for myself, my faith and my belief structure plays a huge part in my life and what I experience. And so it's kind of what I identify. And so I think that's hard to, I think unless you're just a complete and total atheist that believes in nothing, I think it would be hard to 100% separate that belief structure that you have and just purely look at it, with through the lens of what is this through science or whatever. I think that our belief structure plays a bigger part than what people realize.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that even if you're an atheist, you still believe in that there's nothing there.
That's right. You still believe in
It's like,
something.
yeah, it's like the different side of the same coin, isn't it?
That's true. That is very
Yeah.
true. And for me, this is because I've experienced, doing this for 15 years, I've experienced a lot of things I can't explain. And to me, it's actually strengthened my belief in an afterlife. And honestly has been really comforting because, I have experienced some darker entities, but I've also experienced a lot that we've been able to validate. I like to go into it from a historical perspective and visit these locations, do a lot of research on the history, and try to get answers and responses that either validate the history that I've researched or get responses that just validates what that they are there. Maybe not so much just from the history, but kind of to share their story further. And, an example of that is a location that I highlighted in season 5. It was an old jail, the Fentress County Jail. One of the inmates, and of course, when you're talking about jails, you've got hundreds of thousands of people that have gone through these jails over their years, 100 years in existence. And so, I had been doing some research on one of the more famous inmates who was in this jail, and his name was Billy Dean Anderson, and um, he was kind of an escape artist. When they would catch him, he spent 7 years on the FBI's most wanted list, and during that time, he actually hid out in a cave. And Billy Dean was he when he was in his teens, he wanted to be a preacher, and so he did preach in the church. He was a very, very famous artist, and so while he was on the run in the cave and throughout his time, of being a criminal, he painted several hundred photos of Christ. And so some of these photos are still in some of the churches. Some of them are kind of obscure. But I went into this location. I did a lot of research on him, not really knowing if I would be able to make contact, but I wanted to see. And so I took in a couple different trigger items, and I took in some paintbrushes, and I never said what I had brought in, because I didn't want to run the risk of my phone, picking up on the microphone, me saying this or what have you. So I was using the Ovilus 5, which is a voice box. And then I was also using the SB7 Spirit box. And of course, the SB7 Spirit box, if your listeners aren't familiar, is like an AM/FM radio station that sweeps through the stations, and you can set the sweep rate. And the theory is that the spirits use the white noise to communicate. The Ovilus 5, they use the word bank to communicate. And so I'm sitting in the room, and I pull out of my bag, I pull out a paintbrush, and I held it up, never said at all during the entire investigation. And this was my second night investigating there, because I did it 1 week, then I came back. I held it up and was kind of holding it around, and I said, "Can you tell me what this is? If you can tell me what this is, you can have it." And across the spirit box, it says paintbrush. And then right after, it says mine. And so sometimes it's kind of hard to hear them in the moment. And I didn't hear the paintbrush, but I heard mine. And I'm like, okay, I'll have to go back and listen. So I went ahead and I took that paintbrush into one of the cells, and I called out his name, and I started using the Ovilus. And I said, Billy Dean, I said, "Can you tell me what this is?" And on the Ovilus, it says paint. And I was honestly blown away, because I have no explanation other than the fact that he saw what I was holding up. So fast forward a little bit further in that investigation, and what I was trying to do, because in the beginning I wasn't getting a lot of response. And so I wanted to create an environment as to what the spirits might be used to inside of that jail. And so I took some playing cards, and I'm like, "Would you like to play a game?" And it said guess. And I said, "Okay, yeah, we're going to play a guessing game." So I dealt out 5 cards, and I said, "I'm going to turn each of these cards over. And I want you to call out either the color, the suit, or the number of the card." And so out of those 5 cards, it actually called out 3 of the cards. It called out a 7, it called out a king, and I believe it said black. And so I was floored, because, it was a random draw of these cards. And whoever I was speaking with, whether it was Billy Dean Anderson or someone else inside there, they clearly could see me. And that's one of the things that I like to test when I go, is to see if they can actually see me, if they can see color, if they can, actually experience what we're experiencing. And those couple tests really kind of showed me that, and I was honestly blown away by by how that the responses that I was getting on that.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So you say you use the spirit box, and what you just mentioned,
Yes.
you use also other methods of making actual contact with them.
I do. One of my favorite things to use are my dowsing rods. I love using those.
What are those?
So essentially they're copper rods that, so you hold on to the handles. The handles
Right.
are inside the little sheath, and so they free spin. And people here will use them to find water. They can also be used to find bodies in unmarked graves. But I like using those because you don't have the battery drain. You also, they're very simple, and they're very familiar to the spirits. If you ask, them to point to the door, or to point to something, or to ask yes and no questions, it's a little more simple than asking a spirit from the early 1900s, to touch a lot, because they may consider a lot to be like a candle or something. So it's really a familiar. I use that. I love my EDI Plus box. That's like an atmosphere box. It gives the temperature in real time. It gives the temperature. It gives the humidity. The I'm drawing a blank on my words. The humidity, the pressure. A lot of the time when pressure changes, I've found we get a lot of EVPs when it notes a pressure change. So I like to use that box. It's also got a vibration sensor in it, but I like to use it in conjunction with other tools to see if when a flashlight goes off or when an EVP happens, I like to see if something registers in the atmosphere to kind of validate that. But I like using flashlights. I use those a lot, those mini mag lights, just for simple yes and no questions. And then, of course, your K2s, your REM pods. I have a whole lot of tools, but I've gotten over the last little bit with being on the motorcycle and stuff, I've gotten to become really simplified with my tools and really specific. And then also, if I can research beforehand, taking trigger items like taking the paint brushes when he's an artist, or taking alcohol or cigarettes when you're going to a jail, those sort of things.
Mm-hmm. Right. Have you ever used a medium?
I have on occasion. So typically for me, I'm a solo investigator. So a lot of the time it's just myself or my videographer that's with me. And sometimes I do collaborations like with Soul Sisters and VP Paranormal and Jake Fife, those individuals. But for the most part, I did work on a case. It was a residential case, and we did end up having to call a demonologist in. And when we did, he brought a medium with him, and she was able to validate a lot of the stuff that I got as an investigator, and then also that he was experiencing as a demonologist. She was able to sort of bridge that gap, and that's been one of the only times that I've done that. But we've done that at the jail. We've had mediums come in that have actually hit on different things that is really kind of mind-blowing, that we know and we've not released to the public, and there would be no way that they could research it, but they've been able to pick up on it.
Yeah, I was asking because I had experience with a medium recently, a few months ago, for the first time in my life. Just colleague was like, I'm organizing this, and we need another person there. So I was like, I'll come in. And I talked about the entire thing on a different episode, but it was really interesting because there was 4 of us plus the medium, and I was being very careful. There was another person who was also, like, you could tell she was pretty skeptical. So we didn't talk to the medium. We never met her before. The only thing she knew was that there's going to be 4 of us.
Okay.
Right? And even before the session, we didn't tell her pretty much anything. I sure didn't. And each one of us that was there got some kind of information that she just couldn't have known. It was like really spot on.
Mm-hmm.
It was really interesting. In fact, one of the person that said it was pretty skeptical, she ended up crying.
Oh, wow.
So it was pretty intense.
Yeah, I mean, some of that is hard to explain. I mean, I've met some mediums that are just a little bit full of it, and you just know. But
that's
then
why I was being so careful.
Exactly. I mean, you got to watch your body cues and just because we do give a lot of information that sometimes we don't realize we give. But when you meet the real deal, and I've only met a few of those, but when you meet them, it's truly amazing and mind blowing, because to yourself, how could they have known that? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Even when it was my turn, and she was, like she started talking what was coming through to her. Like I tried to be careful, and just put a bit of a poker face on, so she can't really tell, like, whether this is hitting home or not. After a moment, when she kept going, I was like, okay, this seems to be pretty legit. And you can also tell from the vibe of the person, like if they're making stuff up or not. And this was overall was a really nice experience, actually. And she had a pretty good vibe. You could tell that she's honest.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can, if you're good at reading people, I mean, you can tell. And I had two readings that I had, and they just happened to be ones, they're people whose shows I was getting ready to go on, and it was like a pre-interview. One of them was an actual interview, one of them was a pre-interview where we were meeting, and it was over the phone. So there was like no way he could see what I was, he couldn't read any body cues because I was being quiet the entire time. And I wasn't even expecting a reading. And he even told me, he was like, I'm actually doing a little mini reading of you right now while we're doing our little interview. And I'm like, really? And he starts telling me things, and I mean, he's spot on. He's spot on with names. He's spot on with dates. He's spot on with like things. And again, it was just a very, very short, simple reading, but I was actually blown away because there was no way he could have been reading my eyes or reading my face, because we were on an actual phone conversation. And then the other one, it was after a podcast, and it was with two people. One is a medium, one is not. And so as we're doing this phone interview, I mean, again, we're not seeing each other, or audio interview. The host actually texts me on my phone and says that his co-host wants to talk to me about something after the show. Would I be willing to jump on a call with her and have a conversation with her? And I'm like, yeah, that'd be fine. And so get off the phone, and she tells me, she's like, or get off the podcast, and she's like, I have a message for you. And she's telling me this message. And I honestly had a lot of respect for her that she didn't stop the show that we were on and say, oh, I'm getting a message, let me tell you about it, and then make it about her rather than making it about the message and turning the show that we were doing into that. She waited till we were off the air until it was a private conversation. So I actually had a lot of respect that she did that, and that actually made the reading that much better. And that was truly the first time I'd ever had any type of reading. And like I said, that, and then the one that I just recently had this past week over the phone, neither one of them I had gone to seek out. And both of those people, they were just very simple, to the point, and they're like, here's what it is, So I was truly fascinated by that, and I felt they were legit and the real deal.
Yeah. Well, some people tend to be searching for the right word. I don't think susceptible is the best way of that's describing it. Like more open to receiving these messages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would imagine, as a medium, I would imagine that you never know what you're going to be, how you're going to be received, especially because I've had several on my show that I've asked, have you ever been like at a grocery store and somebody get a message for the person in front of you, and several of them have said yes. Several of them have said that they don't approach people and tell them. And one lady even told me, she was like, I typically don't, but this person kept on and kept on and kept on, and I kept running into her at the store too. And so I went ahead and spoke to the lady, and we ended up finding a ring that she had been missing and looking for. This information that this person gave me led her in that direction. And so, but I've had several that have said, yeah, if I get a message for somebody, I just up and tell them. And sometimes they're met with, a lot of skepticism, and it's like, I don't want to have this conversation. They're not open to it. But then other times people are very open, and it's almost like a life-changing moment for them. So I can only imagine, as as a person that might be a medium, just how it would be if you're constantly bombarded by messages and by spirit. I would think that would be something you would have to really learn to control.
Yeah, definitely. One of my friends who was on my podcast twice, Alison Finley, she told me when she was younger, she's coming from a Christian background, and things like spirits and that kind of stuff, it just doesn't really go along that well, especially with the way she was brought up. So she ended up suppressing a lot of the things that she saw and experienced, and she basically ended up being suicidal and depressed.
Oh yeah.
But once she kind of overcame her upbringing and opened up to it, that's when things got a lot better for her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she learned to deal with it, basically.
Yeah, I think there's a big learning, not just learning to focus it, but also how to deal with it. I couldn't imagine, especially someone that's picked this up from a young age, because it is different, and it is something that a lot of people are skeptical about, and they probably are constantly having to prove themselves. Some people don't care, if you believe them or not. Some truly do, and I can see that, why that would affect her in that way.
Yeah, definitely. And kids in general, they seem to be a lot more open to this stuff, and it almost seems like almost every kid can have some kind of experience like this. I remember listening to an interview, which was surprising enough, with a preschool teacher. I guess that's how you call it in English.
Yes.
From the Czech Republic. And it was interesting because she said that she was initially very skeptical and atheist, right? But her working with kids that were like less than 5 years old, and them telling her all sorts of crazy things, like, either it was meeting entities or having telling her experiences from past lives, from other planets even, and stuff like that. That really got her thinking, and she ended up being more spiritual and more open to these ideas. So,
yeah,
is the problem is that when the adults come in, the parents of the kids, like, oh, you're just imagining it, this kind of stuff. It really shuts down that, because obviously the brain is in development, and certain connection within the brain, if they are not reinforced, they're gonna just disappear because they're not being used or anything like that. So
absolutely. And that's one of the things too, when I was a member of the team, if somebody reached out to us and there was a kid involved, whether it be like the kid was experiencing things, had imaginary friends, or what have you, they always got bumped up to the top of the list, that because you do have to treat those kind of different, when children are involved. And children do seem to, whether it be psychic, empathic abilities or mediumships, or even just spirit communication, children do tend to see that stuff more often. And, it just, I don't know if it's one of those things. I mean, you said it best there, where if they're not using it, it just kind of fades away.
yeah.
But when it comes to like seeing the spirits or having the interactions, I think too, as a kid gets older, they're they're taught that, well, there's these logical explanations, there's you're not as open-minded as an adult, or at least most people aren't. So I think that the interaction with the spirit, it tends to kind of dwindle a little bit more when we get older, just because of the way, the adult mind works.
Yeah, definitely. Just came to my mind, even with animals, they can be also very interesting. There was a video that I saw on Instagram, it just randomly popped up. And it was a really strange one, even if you take out the people who uploaded or took the video, what they say, it still was a strange video to see, because there was a cat. I can't remember, it was sat on the floor or on a sofa or something, and she sat on her hind legs, and she like it looked like something was flying around, but you couldn't see anything there. And the cat was like trying to reach it, and she was being very curious. And it said in the video that the video was taken maybe a few hours, very shortly after their dog passed away.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I mean, animals absolutely can. There at the jail, we have a cat that lives in the jail. She showed up one day back in April, and she was a stray. So we ended up taking her in, getting her spayed, and she, litter training her, and so she lives at the jail. And so during the day, she'll go outside sometimes, but she stays in there and she sleeps in there at night. Now, we keep the two upper floors closed off, so she can't go up there at night. But for the longest time, there was certain rooms she wouldn't go into. Other times, like if we were doing a flashlight tour and nothing was happening, sometimes she would walk into the room and the K2 meters would start going off, because it was like the spirits were like, oh my gosh, there's Sally. And then other times we would be sitting there telling the history and talking, and next thing you know, you hear this loud purring, and she's just kind of laying back like something's petting her. And then we've also had, there've been 2 occasions to where she'll go over to the bars and she'll reach through the bars like she's playing, or she'll stand up like she's swatting at something, and there's nothing there. And so I believe she's seeing something, and someone that we can't see is playing with her. I definitely believe that she sees what we don't see.
Yeah.
And that could be that spectrum that you were talking about earlier, about hearing and seeing on a different spectrum. I think that maybe they can see, and that they're communicating on that different spectrum that we just can't quite see, but they can.
Yeah. And obviously, there's no cultural bias against these kinds of things.
Right.
In animals, is there?
Exactly.
Like some other cat's gonna come, oh, that's just nonsense.
Right. Exactly. But it's been interesting having her there and seeing. I'd like to do more experiments with her, but we try to be careful with her, in the sense of, if she is feeling skittish or if she's feeling uncomfortable, we don't force her to go somewhere. But if she does go on her own and something's happening, we really try to pay attention to that, because clearly she's experiencing something that we're not. And it's always been kind of fascinating. We sort of wondered how it would affect the spirits and how it would affect her, when we decided to let her essentially be the shop cat. And she seems to love it. Now, I'm sure she's happy just to be out from outside, but yeah, we've had some really interesting occurrences just with her there, that personally myself, I'd like to look a little deeper into.
Mm-hmm. And have you ever researched any sightings of cryptids at any point?
Not a whole lot. There was one location that I did investigate, which is called Octagon Hall, which is in Franklin, Kentucky. And there's a lot of interesting things surrounding this house. It was very instrumental during the Civil War. The house truly is octagon shaped. And the guy that built it, he was a Freemason. And so there are some hidden Masonic symbols there in that home. It's also runs along the 37th parallel. It's there are ley lines there, and it's interesting. This particular house, people who go there, they not only experience a lot of paranormal activity, but they also experience cryptids and UFO activity. And it's the one place that I've been to that's had all of these claims right there at the house and on the property. And I did do a Sasquatch session there with some friends, and that was my first time doing that. And it was enough to kind of draw me in to want to do it again. We did hear some calls when we were knocking on the trees and calling out. We did get some return calls. But I've had some people on my show that's all they do is research cryptids. And in the beginning, I'll say, it's kind of like, how can these exist? But after traveling and really just seeing how dense some of the woods are, and how how there are some places that these entities could hide in and not be seen. They could even be related to the paranormal in some way, or related to extraterrestrial. So I'm definitely open-minded about it. And again, I've had some people talk about it on my show, which has been insightful to me. But as far as like actually doing a lot of research on it, I personally myself, I've not done any investigating other than the one time at Octagon Hall.
Right. Interesting. So I haven't spoken about this kind of topic on the podcast yet. Hopefully more in the future.
Yes, there's some interesting folks here that have done, and again, it's a lot of regional too. There's some areas that have different types of cryptids here in the U.S. That we don't experience so much over here in the East.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting topic, and like you said, the forests are vast.
Yes.
Like even in here in Sweden, God knows what's hiding in the forest, because it's Sweden is 96%, if not more, just forests.
Wow.
And there's less than 10 million people, or around 10 million people living here. And the area is like twice as the size of the UK, and like 1/6 of the people living here. So, and then places like the Amazonian rainforest and deserts, not to mention the ocean. There's lots of white spots on maps.
Absolutely. And
assuming these beings are actual creatures, just like apes or something like that.
Exactly. If they can cross interdimensions or what have you, obviously that makes sense. But I know just being in some of these areas, you can kind of understand how they could hide, which in the beginning, I really didn't know. In my mind, I couldn't justify how is that possible that there aren't more sightings. But I tell you, the phenomenon, the missing 411 phenomena, or the just unexplained disappearances, that's something that does freak me out and scare me. Especially, we have a lot in this area, and I know that David Pilatus, he's been able to kind of associate that with the cave systems and stuff here in the U.S. But I'll listen to those stories, especially, the national park disappearances. And some of them they believe could, he really doesn't say. I did have Steve Stockton on my show, and he's written several books on national park disappearances. And, whether it's related to cryptids or UFOs, there's different cases that kind of allude to that. And that's probably the phenomena that actually I'll go sit in a abandoned building and talk to spirits, and they can jump out at me and it doesn't really freak me out. But for some reason, those disappearances, those actually really kind of freak me out. And it has me curious whether it is related to the cryptid activity, or if it could be related to something more sinister, maybe, ET. And then does the National Park Services know about it? That's been that phenomenon I'm just completely fascinated by. And any opportunity I get to listen to more podcasts on it or to research it, I dive right in. But man, it scares me when I do.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. For those who don't know, apparently within all these national parks, and from what David Paulides was talking about, this happens all over the world, not
Yeah.
just in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And from what he said, the people working in these places, they do know about it. So obviously you have people going missing all the time in these national parks, where they get eaten by predators or just get lost in there. It happens. But out of these cases, there's a subset of them which there's no explanation to what happens to them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I remember hearing about a case, might have been in this documentary. And there's also a new one coming out about this phenomenon, about missing 411.
Uh-huh.
So in this older one that I saw a couple of years ago, there was one kid that went missing. And many times it's like someone just looks away for a second, then they look back and suddenly the person is gone forever.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, this kid went missing. They would search the area, couldn't find anything. And then I think it was like a few years later, at least months, it might have been a few years later, someone went around this place and just like on the top of a hill, so not like very close to the place where this kid went missing, they found like, I remember the shoes were there.
Yes.
And they looked like someone placed them just like a few hours ago.
Mm-hmm.
Which was pretty freaking weird.
Yeah, and they'll be in
this,
places they've already looked, and a lot of the time it's around like boulder fields. It'll be around water.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be like you said, a shoe or sometimes two shoes, or there'll be like the clothes. They'll find that. There's like all these characteristics of some of these people that they found, and it's fascinating. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that one actually, the one you're talking about, happened in the Smoky Mountains, which is here in East Tennessee. Yeah. But there's so many that have these similar stories that, and if they do find the people, they're like missing all this time. And there are a few they find. And I know that I was listening to one out of Seattle, Washington, where this girl, she got in her car from a coffee shop, and she was supposed to go and be doing her homework and all this, and she ended up going the opposite direction and then driving into I believe it was either the Sierra Mountains, or might have been around Mount Shasta, but she ends up driving and for no unknown reason gets out of her car, just abandons her car, walks into the woods, and she is found, and she has no recollection of really even, they had her on security footage filling up with gas, getting her coffee, and getting in her car and going in the opposite direction. But she had no recollection as to why, how, and even when, she got there. And then people even like showing up on the opposite ends of the country. And I know there was one, he had a haircut. He was wearing a new jacket. He had a haircut, and I think he had been missing for 6 or 8 months. And he didn't remember anything about it. He just showed up on someone's doorstep. Yeah.
Well, so he went missing for 6 to 8 months, and he couldn't remember. He just suddenly appeared after such a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Appeared at, I can't remember if he went to a relative that he knows home or if he went to someone else's home, but they said he had a fresh haircut and new jacket, and he doesn't remember anything about it. So the ones that do resurface, and there's not a lot that do, but the ones that do, there's always some kind of weird missing time story. And it's interesting because you're right. I mean, it happens all over the world, and it's very strange and bizarre and absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. There's some cases where even kids of the age of less than 5 years or 2 year olds, when they're actually found.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite sure if that's what happened. One of the kids, I remember, they said that it was like a big cat that carried them, or some kind of animal, which
Mm-hmm.
didn't make sense whatsoever. But they found them in places where, considering how long they were missing, there was no way a 2 year old could have traveled
Mm-hmm.
such a distance on their own
Mm-hmm.
in those conditions in that place
Mm-hmm.
in that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you hear about that. I mean, they'll be like miles away in a very, very short
Yeah.
time frame. Yeah, 2 and 3 year olds, and a lot of the time they're missing a shoe or missing their shoes. Yeah.
Interesting stuff. I almost got actually a person on the show who worked with Dave Paulides, and she also basically collects stories from experiences of any kind. And I listened to one podcast that she did with someone else, and this is an interesting story. So I thought I'd share this.
Mm-hmm.
So she lives in Texas, and that's where she was when this happened. She, I can't remember for what reason. I think she went hiking to, somewhere in woods. And she said that it's not a place you would go during the night. It's like it's okay to go during the day, but you don't want to go there during the night. And then afterwards, she thought that she would stay at this parking lot, which was like a few miles away from the nearest person. And so it was night, it was dark, and she was there, and suddenly she hears screams from somewhere. And she said that the way she described it, it's not like from a movie or if someone just jumps or something. It was like a really blood curdling scream, like someone's getting murdered or something. Woman. So she was like, "What the hell's going on?" Thankfully, it's Texas, so she had a gun on her. She went out and shot a few rounds just in the air, and she took a few steps away from the car, and then she heard that scream again. This time it was a bit further away. It was like coming from the forest, and she was like, start thinking, okay, how many rounds can I just shoot in the air before I run out of ammo?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to go like into a forest just like when you're on your own and you don't know what's going on. And the moment she realized she saw, like, I don't know how far it was from her, she saw a figure standing there, like, fairly far away, but she could see the figure, and it looked kind of human, and suddenly it started moving towards her, and she said it was like it didn't move like a human would, if someone starts running towards you or something. So she was like, okay, screw this. I'm going away. She got into a car and drove off. But then she was saying, like, got her thinking, like, what actually happened there? That scream, was it trying to like lure her into a forest, and she would go further into a forest? Like, what would happen then? And this other figure, which scared her enough for her to leave, like, as scary as it was, it could have saved her life.
That's right.
For what she knows. Maybe he wanted her to just get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
So I found that was quite interesting what she was saying. It was like,
yeah,
what was actually going on there?
Right, because you never know if that figure was connected to the scream, or again, if it was.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Or something more benevolent trying to actually save her by, basically telling her to fuck off.
Yeah, basically, yeah. I mean, that's where listening to your gut and stuff, whether you be in the forest like that and something like that happens, or whether you're at an investigation and you feel like something is just not right and you need to step out and ground yourself and get away. You've got to listen to that, because the consequences could be bad. And and sometimes we just never really know why things happen. But that's good of her to like stop and think about that, and try to kind of reason, because to me that's what that sounds like. It doesn't sound like the scream was related to whatever this being or entity was that approached her.
I think it was coming from a different direction as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, again, if she would go into a forest, like, would there be another 411 case?
Very possible.
Who knows?
Very possible.
And in her case, like, I've spoken to her on a phone call, and even though she was on a few podcasts, you can tell that she's not seeking out any attention or anything like that. And she's obviously very interested, and there's something interesting about her. Like, even on what was it? I think it was a podcast with Jimmy Church she did.
Oh, okay.
And she said that some people come to her and they're like, some even told her, like, there's something about you that feels like home. And when I was listening to it, I was like, exactly, that's what I felt about her.
Mm-hmm.
When I was talking to her. So, especially if you have people who have personal experiences and they're not seeking out any attention, they're not getting anything out of it, those are the best ones, where you have to think like, you're probably telling the truth, actually.
Absolutely. And that's the people, that you love to hear their stories about, because again, there's nothing to gain from it. And I would love to find out more about her, just because that's a topic that's always fascinated me, because it's so mysterious and also so scary, how there's so many different stories and then it's just so sudden. And plus, living here in the Appalachian Mountains, there's a lot of missing 411 stories in this area, just because we are in the middle of mountains and forests and national parks and stuff over here, and a lot of those underground cave systems and stuff right here in East Tennessee. Yeah, so there's a lot that happens in this area, so that just kind of adds a little bit more of a creep factor onto it.
Right, definitely. I'll definitely, I'm sure I'm going to visit the state at some point, but man, I'm going to be really careful if I go. I love nature and going to nature, but after hearing all this stuff, your mind just goes straight towards those things.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Steve Stockton is a good one that does those national park stories. That definitely look up his stuff, and he's great to talk to as well. So
what do you think is the connection there between all these phenomena? Because for like the average person, they might hear about Bigfoot and aliens and ghosts and stuff, and they don't really think about that it might be somehow connected or that. But it does really seem like, even though that I've heard that people researching UFOs, they don't like people researching Bigfoot for some reason, vice versa. But I've heard many times from certain researchers that, for example, if you have a UFO hotspot, many times there are going to be some reports about Bigfoot or some other phenomena. Definitely like Skinwalker Ranch, which is a TV series now by George Knapp, reporter, and wrote a book about it. There's a documentary as well. And that's one of the places where you can see all of these things happening. Poltergeist activity, UFOs, cryptids, everything.
Yeah, and I think it also, so I tend to think they could be related, just from talking to different people that I've had on my show and different people that I've experienced over my time doing this. I do think that it is possible that they could that they could be related. That it's hard to say how. I've had some people think that like Bigfoot and some of those may be a more related to the darker negative entities of the paranormal. Um, I don't know if I necessarily believe that. It's just some of the theory. When you're dealing with like Skinwalker Ranch and stuff, you've got a lot of Native American influence in there, which I think could relate. I don't really know how to explain about them being related, but I think that it's a very good possibility that they could be. Just because, especially when you have certain locations like the Skinwalker Ranch or like the Bel Air House or the Octagon Hall that experience so many different phenomena just right there, whether it be a portal or something that's kind of calling out and bringing in the UFO activity. I mean, it could be us. It could be the fact that we're talking, we're almost like a beacon, we're communicating with these spirits and with these different entities that maybe they're like, okay, so people who can do this are coming to this place. This is where I'm going to go. So I do tend to think that I don't really know how, but I do think that some of this could definitely be related because, again, there's a lot of different similarities. I've had people talk about the relation of Bigfoot sightings to UFO sightings. That's very common in some of these places when a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch is seen. There's a lot of UFO activity happening. So I think that there needs to be more data, more correlative data to kind of, I don't know whether it's like really sitting down and talking about the experiences of these and really mapping that out. I think there needs to be more of that to see, to be able to determine just how related these phenomena are.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely need more data and proper scientific research.
Yeah.
Although, unfortunately, there's not much money to be made in this, so
right.
There's obviously not going to be also much research. But even if, I remember when I was in my teens, I picked up in a bookstore the book from John Keel, The Mothman Prophecies, which I mentioned earlier in this interview. And the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, super interesting book, even better than movie. But even in his book, he mentioned that he obviously had this Mothman thing, really tall with wings and glowing red eyes, appearing in many places in the town. But at the same time, he also had lights in the sky appearing, people meeting some. There was this one person who met supposedly an alien from the galaxy of Ganymedes. It's actually the name of the biggest moon of Jupiter. But so there was lots of things going on at the same time in that place as well. And also, when you're talking about cryptids, you look at even at tablets of the ancient Sumerians, or you look at the inside of a temple in Egypt, and they would portray also the strange creatures there, which are like even the Sphinx, like body of a cat or something, and a human head. Then you had all these other creatures depicted there. And it's like, it makes you think like what's going on there. Also, the thing is that when people take psychedelics, for example, ayahuasca, DMT, they also meet certain entities there, and many times they look like Egyptian gods. Or I remember in one book, Graham Hancock, he was in South America, he did ayahuasca. In one case, he actually met two beings that really looked like gray aliens.
Wow.
So that really makes you think like, what's going on there?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've always wondered about it. I mean, especially in the fact when you can look back at those ancient writings and ancient texts and stuff and see that they were experiencing, again, the similarities, and that information flow was not flowing like it is today. And so, again, I think that has to just kind of prove that there's some relation, or at least some correlation to everything that's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, we're getting close to 2 hours, so let's all finish off.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, before at the end of my interviews, I usually ask my guests a few questions.
Mm-hmm.
So, if there was one piece of advice you could give to people, what would it be?
Definitely, if you're looking to get into the paranormal and such, definitely keep an open mind, and patience. Got to have a lot of patience, because it doesn't happen like it does on a lot of, or shows on a lot of these paranormal entertainment shows. They whittle down a week of an investigation into 30 minutes or an hour. And so my biggest thing is, you know, always go in, keep that open mind, have that patience, and always, just take a simple recorder. Don't invest in a lot of equipment starting out, but take a recorder in, and always, always go back, review that video and audio, because even though it may seem like a quiet night or a quiet experience, there may be things on that recorder that you capture that you didn't realize was happening in the moment.
Great. And this is a question I don't really ask at the end, but I forgot to ask it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Considering what you've experienced whilst doing these investigations and everything that you experienced or heard from other people, how did it change you, and how did it change your worldview? And also, like, notion of what's life about, what comes afterwards.
That's a good question. I've always I'm a Christian. I've always been in church, and always had a belief in the afterlife. However, these conversations and the evidence and investigations that I've gone on, for me, it's really strengthened and enhanced that belief in an afterlife. And I've to me, it makes me not really fear death, because it just shows that after this happens, to me personally, I don't believe there's just nothing. I believe that there is something, and that it's really just strengthened that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it's actually a good thing about all
Absolutely.
these
Absolutely.
phenomena. Because I came from I don't come from a religious background. The last two generations in my family, mainly due to communism, they were atheists.
Mm-hmm.
So I come to this really just trying to find out what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's the truth? Okay, so I never had a bias one way or the other.
Right.
If the evidence shows me that there's nothing, that it's literally like the atheists say, and the materialists that die inside turning off a computer and just
Mm-hmm.
nothing, not even that. I'd be like, okay, I guess that's what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But so far, everything that I've researched, that I've heard from people, experienced myself, that just shows that there's a lot more to life.
Mm-hmm.
Reality is not what we think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And once you pass away, there seems to be some kind of a continuation of your consciousness.
That's how it appears, based on and taking that religious bias out of it, just from what we're experiencing. That's how it seems to me. Absolutely.
Yeah. And to be fair, it does sound a lot better than the notion that it's just nothing.
Just it, yeah.
Right, last question, which I do ask people. What do you think is the meaning of life?
That's a tough question. Really, to me, it's all about those connections and experiences. And we're only given so many trips around the sun, and being able to make the most of that, and be content, make the most of that, and making those connections with other people, that just, to me, makes life more rich and more valuable, when you're able to connect and surround yourself by people from different areas and different backgrounds that you may not feel like you have a lot in common, but you've got enough to make that connection and connecting on a different level. So that's kind of, at this point in time, how I feel about it. That could change in a few days. I feel like I'm always learning, and doing this with the paranormal and researching, alternate realities and stuff has really, really led me in that direction.
Yeah, and there's always a lot to learn.
Yes,
and you have to learn it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
if we stop learning,
yeah, it's no good.
No. Then what?
Great, it was. Yeah, it was great talking to you. So where can people find you and your work?
Yes, and again, thank you for having me on tonight.
Anytime.
So people can go back and they can watch past seasons of Ghost Biker Explorations, seasons 1 through 5, on the Ghost Biker Explorations Facebook page, Ghost Biker Explorations YouTube channel, and www.ghostbikerexplorations.com. They can also find out about the historic Scott County Jail at www.historicscottcojail.com.
Great. And for my listeners, if you experience anything you can explain, we would love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
Writing a comment, get in touch with us personally. We love to hear that. And thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your time, Miranda. And if you guys like the episode, give a like, share it with your friends, leave a comment. It really helps a lot. So see you next one. And as always, all the links are in the description below. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.